You guys having a blessed night. Back again. Sound went out on my mic. I'm not sure how. So I decided to come back on here, do another part 2 video. Egypt is in Africa. Salute to ISHOWSPEED, sharing his journey, his adventure with us as he tours beautiful Africa. For me, thought it was very telling. The limited disclosure, full transparency on just the history of almost minimization and diminishing the Black influence in our history. This is something I'm very passionate about. As you know, if you are familiar with this channel, very unapologetically Black. So I wanted to do a little bit of a background of the Black African-led Egypt. Egypt has been transformed in many different ways, from the Romans, the Greeks, to Islam. A lot of different populations have come into Egypt and completely reorganized the face of Kemet, as it was originally named. Black African-led Egyptian civilization ruled continuously for approximately 3,000 to 3,500 years before Greek rule, 332 BCE. All right, nearly 3,800 years before Roman rule, 30 BCE, and over 4,000 years before Islamic conquest. So when Black African kingship begins, this is 3,100 BCE, ancient Egyptian civilization, which is really ancient Kemet, not really Egyptian, as that was the Greek renaming of the territory. Ancient Egyptian civilization begins with the early dynastic period around 3,100 BCE, traditionally marked by the reign of Narmer, spelled here Narmer, also known as Menes. I might be butchering that wrong. Means. Archaeological evidence, including skeletal remains, art, burial practices, and cultural continuity, places early Egyptian civilization firmly within the Nile Valley African populations, culturally and biologically, connected to Nubia and Upper Africa. The sources is from Manethos Egyptiaca, Egyptian priest historian, 3rd century BCE, Archaeology of Upper Egypt, Nakeda culture, and the UNESCO General History of Africa, Volume 2. Here, Black African rule before the Greek invasion around 3,100 to 332 BCE. From 3,100 BCE to 332 BCE, Egypt was ruled by native African dynasties for roughly 2,700 years before Alexander the Great entered Egypt. This includes the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, Egypt's most powerful and culturally influential eras. I noticed in a lot of the history of Kemet, you'll notice that dominant terminology is centered around more of the word Egypt, which again was assigned to Kemet from the Greeks. So these dynasties that were built during the African-led rule here, which it's always been African, but specifically Black African. Okay. This channel is not going to be for everybody. I'm going to keep talking about our history, keep doing the research. So, you can leave your hateful comments and all the BS. I'm just going to get rid of you. I don't got time for that for the new year. So these dynasties built the pyramids, global trade networks with Nubia, Punt, and sub-Saharan Africa, advanced medicine, astronomy, law, and theology. Greek writers themselves acknowledged Egypt as older and African. This is documented. So it says here, the Nubian Kushite Black African rule continues through the 25th dynasty, 744 through 656 BCE. Even after internal disruptions, Egypt was reunified by Nubian Kushite kings from present-day Sudan, known as the 25th dynasty, explicitly recognized in Egyptian records as Black African rulers. This includes Pai, Piye, and Taharka. They ruled Egypt as Africans, restoring Ma'at, not as foreigners. The sources are Pai Victory Stele, Assyrian royal records, and the temple inscriptions at Karnak. Greek rule begins around the lake 332-30 BCE. Greek rule begins only after Alexander the Great invades Egypt in 332 BCE, meaning Egypt had already existed for nearly 3,000 years. Even then, Ptolemies ruled by adopting Egyptian religion and titles, acknowledging the legitimacy of African kingship traditions. The length comparison compared to Greek rule was about 300 years. The African dynasties were 2,700 years. Sources are from the Plutarch, Life of Alexander, Ptolemaic temple inscriptions. The Roman rule is even shorter, 30 BCE to 395 CE. Roman control begins in 30 BCE after Cleopatra's death. Egypt became a Roman province, not a sovereign civilization. Roman rule lasts around 400 years, primarily as economic exploitation of African grain. Sources: the Roman imperial records, Tacitus, the Annals. This is so important to me to break down Black African history. And I love when I get rebuttals, when I get the hate. That just goes to show me I need to go even harder. Like I'm just getting started. Like I'm not your typical content creator where I'm just so overly dependent on social desirability, popularity, social narratives, where a lot of these content creators sort of like in a subtle way have communicated to the audience that the audience's voice and power and their likability is more stronger and influential than a content creator themselves. I don't play by those rules. I don't play by those rules. I never really did. And for centuries, it has just been the order of the day, from the burning of the books in Alexandria to just burning down any sort of like indication of Black African excellence. And it's become so normalized that a lot of you younger folks, you're so dumbed down. Take it how you fucking want it. Okay? You're so dumbed down, you're so ignorant that you've just completely accepted the minimization and the almost disrespect to Black excellence. And you come on YouTube with your miserable ass lives. Never served your country, never served your people, only serving yourselves. And you put all this nastiness, all this BS on there. And I take that shit as fuel. I'm just like, you know what? This is why we need more Black leaders. We need more Black people who are unapologetically Black. And you got to go and rise above the audience. You got to be bigger than your supporters to make a fucking difference. Randy Wineglass, licensed marriage and family therapist. I do this shit. All right? Block motherfuckers. Well, you'll never come back. And I sleep great at night. Good. Okay? Just let me reintroduce myself to you guys. All right? I love my culture. I love my people. YouTube could ban this motherfucker tomorrow. I'm still gonna do the work. Just know that shit. All right. I think a lot of you guys come into people's channels and you think, oh, I have the power, right? I'm gonna say some hateful ass shit. I'm gonna type. I'm gonna be a typing gangster. I'm a thug typer, and I'm gonna sway the narrative. That's how a lot of you white folks, especially you non-Black folks, even you niggas, okay? That's how you think. See, but you got some new shit with me. All right? Fuck with me. So, Islamic conquest occurs very late, 639 to 642 CE. The Arab Islamic conquest of Egypt occurs in the 7th century CE, over 4,000 years after African civilization began in Egypt. By this point, Egypt had already passed through African, Greek, and Roman phases. Everybody want a piece of our shit. We want a piece of Rome. We want a piece of Greece. I want a piece of Europe. You want a piece of my shit. I make you pop. Okay? Sometimes you gotta humble motherfuckers. Like, you want what Africa got. Africa don't really want what you got. I don't want what you got. Okay? Let's just set the stage here. This shit ain't for everybody. This channel ain't for everybody. And you leaving, if you come in with that negativity and that hate, you do this shit better over here. You help me by leaving. So don't threaten me with a good time. I'm telling you why this timeline is often obscured. I'm gonna say it again. Western education frequently compresses African history and expands European periods. A 300-year Greek period is often emphasized more than 2,700 years of African rule, creating a false impression of origin and ownership. This is the type of people we're dealing with. What did this distortion do? Help detach Egypt from Africa, justify colonial ideology, undermine African civilizational legitimacy? What a joke. Summary timeline. 3100 BCE, African kings unify Egypt. 3100 to 332 BCE, the 2700 years of African rule. 744 to 656 BCE, Nubian Black African dynasty rules Egypt. 332 BCE, Greek invasion. 30 BCE, Roman occupation. 639 CE, Islamic conquest. Black African kings ruled Egypt for nearly 3 millennia before Greece arrived, nearly 4 millennia before Rome, and over 4,000 years before Islamic conquest. I'm just getting started, man. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the earlier 3rd century BCE in the African city of Alexandria, was not merely a library in the modern sense, but an intellectual complex that included lecture halls, laboratories, observatories, and residential quarters for scholars. It was established under the rule of Ptolemy I Soter, who inherited Egypt after Alexander's death and sought to consolidate power by making Egypt the global center of knowledge. Crucially, Alexandria was built on Egyptian intellectual foundations, Kemet intellectual foundations, not Greek ones alone. Long before Greek scholars arrived, Kemet already possessed millennia of written records in mathematics, in medicine, in astronomy, engineering, theology, statecraft. The library's mission was to collect all human knowledge, but much of what it housed originated in Africa itself. Africa and African intellect was not peripheral to the library, it was central. Egyptian priests, scholars, scribes, and scientists contributed knowledge developing along the Nile River Valley over thousands of years. Fields such as geometry, used for land measurement after Nile floods, medical surgery, pharmacology, calendar systems, and architectural engineering were already highly advanced in Egypt. Greek figures later celebrated in Western history, such as Euclid and others, studied in Egypt and learned from African teachers. Yet over time, this African origin was obscured, and the knowledge was rebranded as Greek, despite Greek writers themselves even acknowledging Egypt, Kemet, as their teacher. The library thus functioned as a repository of African intellectual achievement, later filtered through a Eurocentric lens. There was no single dramatic burning of the library, rather it suffered multiple waves of destruction between roughly the 1st century BCE and the 7th century CE. These included damage during Roman civil wars, the suppression of non-Christian texts under Christian imperial rule, and later political upheavals. Each phase resulted in the loss of irreplaceable texts. many authored by Black Africans or preserved through African scholarly traditions. Y'all have been hating on us for centuries. You're not going to burn Greek books. You're not going to burn Roman books. You're not going to burn the European books. No, you're going to burn the Black books because that's how much power we're coming with. So, of course, you're going to be in your feelings up in my chat. Of course, you don't want to hear this shit because I'm holding up the mirror to you. Of course, you don't want to hear it. That don't surprise me. I'm not surprised by that. I know who house I'm in. Okay? Not surprised by that. Each phase resulted in the loss of irreplaceable text, many authored by Black Africans or preserved through African scholarly traditions. What was destroyed was not just scrolls, but intellectual continuity, records of African science, philosophy, governance, and cosmology that could have directly challenged later claims that Africa lacked history or intellectual tradition. The disappearance of the library's African centered knowledge had profound consequences. When Europe later rose to global dominance, it did so without confronting written proof that Africa had been a cradle of advanced civilization. This absence made it easier to construct myths of African inferiority that justified colonialism and slavery by disconnecting Egypt from Africa and removing African authorship from ancient knowledge, Western institutions, so they could claim civilization as their inheritance alone. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria therefore represents not just the loss of books, but the systematic weakening of Africa's historical voice, a silence that modern scholarship is only now beginning to correct. They're in there telling ISHOWSPEED, oh, it's because they don't want the wind to go through his nose. That's why they destroyed the nose. Oh, it was because, the birds, they was landing on the nose wrong and it was messing up things. We didn't want the flashlight from the pictures to be too bright, so we had to take the nose out. So what were some Greek gods that all these Greek gods, right? Which were nothing but just photocopies of Egyptian theology. Thoth and Hermes. This Hermes Trismegistus, the Egyptian god Thoth, was the deity of writing, mathematics, astronomy, wisdom, and divine law. When Greeks encountered Kemet, they syncretized Thoth with Hermes, creating Hermes Trismegistus, and later the composite figure Hermes Trismegistus. Greek writers openly admitted Hermes' wisdom was inherited from Egypt, not invented in Greece. This connection shows how African intellectual systems were reframed as Greek philosophy, stripping Kemet of authorship while preserving the content. Ma'at and Themis, cosmic order and justice. The Egyptian principle of Ma'at governed truth, balance, law, and cosmic harmony. Greek mythology mirrors this with Themis, goddess of divine order and justice. Greek law and ethics borrowed heavily from Egypt's moral cosmology, yet Egypt's role was later minimized in Western education. Osiris and Dionysus. You do the math. Death, resurrection, afterlife. The afterlife. The myth of Osiris centers on death, dismemberment, resurrection, and eternal life. Thousands of years before Greek civilization. This narrative parallels Dionysus. I think he's the god of wine. Dionysus. I'm pretty sure I'm butchering it, and it's okay. Whose myths also include death, rebirth, and divine kingship. Greek mystery religions openly acknowledged Egyptian funerary and resurrection theology as their source. Isis and Demeter. Sacred motherhood and agriculture. Isis, an African mother goddess associated with fertility, healing, and protection, parallels Demeter. Both oversee agriculture, life cycles, and maternal devotion. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece reflect Egyptian ritual structures, not the other way around. Horus and Apollo define sun, light, kingship. Horus, the falcon-headed son of Isis, symbolized divine kingship, light, and protection of the state. Greek mythology mirrors this in Apollo, associated with light, prophecy, and order. Egyptian divine kingship predates Greek monarchy by millennia. Egyptian afterlife, judgment in Greek's Hades. Egyptians' Hall of Judgment, where the heart is weighed against Ma'at, predates Greek ideas of moral judgment in the underworld, ruled by Hades. Greek underworld ethics reflect Egyptian moral accountability, not original Greek theology. Sacred geometry and Greek mathematics. Egyptian geometry developed to measure land after Nile floods. It was foundational. Greek mathematicians like Pythagoras studied in Egypt, later claiming discoveries rooted in African engineering. The library preserved Egyptian mathematical systems later labeled Greek. Egyptian cosmology and Greek creation myths. Egyptian cosmology emphasized order emerging from chaos, echoed in Greek myths involving primordial chaos and divine structuring of the universe. Greek cosmology mirrors African metaphysics, nearly point for point. Temples as schools, Greek academies. Egyptian temples function as universities, training priests, scientists in medicine, astronomy, ethics, and governance. Greek academies copied this model centuries later. The Library of Alexandria institutionalized this African educational framework. African spiritual science rebranded as philosophy. What Egypt called sacred science, Greece renamed philosophy. The substance remained African. The authorship changed. This renaming was foundational to Western intellectual dominance. The Library of Alexandria was built on African intellectual traditions, not Greek invention. Egyptian priesthoods had preserved written knowledge for over 3,000 years before the library's founding. This included advanced medicine, surgery, pharmacology, astronomy, stellar calendars, planetary movements, mathematics, geometry, fractions, engineering, architecture, hydraulics, ethics, ma'at, theology, and governance. The library centralized African knowledge and invited scholars from abroad to study it. Greek scholars did not arrive as teachers, but as students. Many texts later credited to Greek thinkers were translations or reinterpretations of Egyptian Achaemenid originals. The library's purpose was accumulation, not creation, and Africa was its primary source. There was no single burning. The library suffered multiple destructions across centuries, from Roman military conflict, including Julius Caesar's fire during the Civil War, Christian imperial decrees suppressing non Christian texts in the 4th century CE, and later political transitions under Islamic rule. Each wave targeted pagan or non conforming knowledge, much of which was African author. The destruction mattered because it erased written proof of African intellectual supremacy. When Europe later colonized Africa, the absence of these records made it easier to claim Africa had no history, no science, and no civilization. Claims contradicted by archaeology but sustained by missing texts. Greek mythology did not emerge in isolation. It is a reframing of African spiritual and intellectual systems, preserved long enough to be copied, then stripped of African identity once the records were destroyed. I'm out.